Welcome to the session, Designing Our Lives. I'm Angela Zhang. I'm your moderator for this workshop. I'm a product marketer at DocuSign, where I lead a portfolio of products around identity verification. And previously, I've spent time at Facebook, Intuit, and the Boston Consulting Group. As I imagine, like many of you, I've been sheltering in place for several weeks. And this time at home and the blurring of all lines between life and work has made me reflect on my choices in both of those areas. So it is with special excitement that I am pleased to introduce you to Virginia Rath and Dr. Barbara Waugh. These two remarkable women will help us use the mindsets and tools of design thinking to answer some of those questions about life, work, and purpose. Virginia is an accomplished scientist, design research consultant, and serial entrepreneur. She was a co-founder of Quotient Design Research and has extensive experience in both quantitative and ethnographic research. She is also a lecturer in the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley and in the D School at Stanford University. Barbara is an executive in residence in the Haas and team coach in the College of Engineering, both at UC Berkeley. She has spent 25 years in HP in leadership roles and is the author of Soul in the Computer, where she detailed how she is able to bring about change in a quite traditional company by doing well, by doing good. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Virginia and Barbara, and let's get this workshop started.
Thank you so much, Angela, for that introduction. And welcome, everybody. We are so excited to be with you today in this activity so critical to our collective rising, designing our lives. You know, Catherine spoke this morning about the power of being seen. And this is a 90-minute period today where we get to look at ourselves and go, self, I see you. And we'll together realize the power of that. Thanks. See you in a second, Virginia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Virginia Rath, and I want to thank the conference organizers for inviting us and Angela for that kind introduction. So I'm going to, and all of you for actually being here this morning from all the places that you come from. So I am going to now start sharing my screen. And here we go. So this is a photo of the San Francisco skyline that was taken by on a cell phone for a friend of mine. You can see the heart on one of the downtown hotels. They actually opened the curtains in each of the windows so that the light would come through, and they actually grew it over time. And we want to use this as a bit of a metaphor for the spirit in which we'd like to engage with you today. And just a reminder, if for those of you who haven't done it already, you should have about 10 pages of blank paper ready to go, and as well as some colored pens. And with that, we will get started. Oops, sorry. Okay, so life in the middle of a global pandemic. This is not news to any of you, I'm sure. We're all getting bombarded by all kinds of conflicting information. Everything from, you know, you should be volunteering, you should be doing something significant, you should be productive. At the same time, we're all trying to figure out what this means for our lives, our futures, our countries, our societies, and at the same time, trying to manage just the day-to-day stress and challenges of doing the ordinary stuff. So we've been coaching people professionally and doing workshops like this one for some time through our business, Porch. And this is our second, what we call the pandemic version of Designing Our Lives. And today what we want to do is focus on the parts of the workshop that we do that we think are going to be particularly useful for you during this time. So we've got lots of different references, sources of inspiration and examples of the courses that we taught, and those will be available on our website for you to look at if you're interested after the workshop. So the question is, why are we doing this workshop now? So the pandemic version really came from our realization that we had to think very differently about how to support our clients. Many of them were just white knuckling it. And I realized, you know, that I was doing the same thing. If I can just hold out till May or June or whatever it is, it'll all be over and we can go back to what feels like normal. But the truth is that it will never be over. Our economy, our world will be forever changed by this experience. And I realized that feeling of white knuckling it was really familiar to me. And it reminded me of getting sober. So I'm a recovering alcoholic. Before I stopped drinking, I actually did a 1-year no contract to not drink. And I changed one behavior. I stopped drinking, just as we've all changed some of our behaviors now. We've stopped going out, or we've stopped gathering in groups, or we started wearing masks. It was a simple behavior. And then I waited. And when that 1 year was over, I went right back to where I was before. And in other words, I was drinking as much as I was drinking before. And I knew then I had to stop. So the point I want to make here is that it was that white knuckling, that resistance to change, that prevented me from seeing all of the changes that I needed to make in my life, that it wasn't just one single behavior or few behaviors. It was once I took off the blinders and opened myself up and accepted embraced the unknown change that was coming towards all of us, I was able to really see a lot more and some choices about what I wanted to do. So I think this is really a tipping point for all of us. And it's an inside job, as you all know. And so I think the question that we'd like to really focus on today is, what do you want to change? What do you personally want to change? So we conceived of this workshop as a space to make that process, a space to begin or deepen that process. So to think about what matters to you most and just leverage the design tools to help you move forward. And I'm going to turn it over to Barb.
So we've been very deliberate in how we've named this activity. We start with designing with the ing form of the verb to emphasize that this is an ongoing, lifelong process. It's not an event, and the end result is not a product. As Catherine said this morning, it's about the journey, not the destination, and it's forever. It's about our lives with the emphasis on relationship, self to self, self to others, self to systems. These are the 3 dimensions in which we have these relationships in our life, and our workplaces have taught us a lot about self to others, because this is about team members, employees, and customers, and self to outer systems. This is about economies, it's about competitive ecosystems, but we've had less emphasis at work, and consequently also less in our private lives, about the relationship of self to self. And that is our focus today. We have an interdependent self concept in that self, and we'll hear more about that in a bit. As well, it's about the plural lives, our own and each other's. Our past lives, which by the way, can be reframed to lead to a very different future than how we've conceived of our past, and the parts of ourselves. Okay, Virginia?
So this is the design cycle that underlies the process we're going to use today. So these are tools that are used by designers who are accustomed to working in situations like the one we're in right now, situations of great uncertainty, incomplete information, and ambiguity. Designers use these kinds of tools to design products and services, and today we're going to apply them to our own lives. So we're going to toggle between the abstract at the top, the concrete at the bottom, and on the left, analysis and synthesis. The quadrants actually, each one actually maps to a learning style, and some of you may be familiar with the Kolb learning styles, K-O-L-B. For those of you who work in teams, studies have shown that if you have all of these different styles represented on the team, they consistently outperform those that don't. Each of the activities we're going to do today has sort of a center of gravity in one of the quadrants. Today we're going to focus on quadrants 1 to 3. But you really need to think of this as kind of a dance floor, and you're actually going to, in practice, you end up, moving all across the floor and rather fluidly using all these different sort of styles of thinking. So where do we start this process of designing our lives? Well, our lives are complicated, and one of the things we've realized in working with clients is that many people just don't really even realize how much is going on in their lives. There's all this stuff in the periphery that they feel responsible for, but yet don't fully acknowledge. And so we end up spending so much time doing that we don't actually have time to sit back and take a look at it as a whole. So this is the opportunity to do that. We start in the concrete phase by observing our lives directly. So how do we do that? We start with a mind map. Many of you may be familiar with this, but for those of you who aren't, a mind map is really a way of, you can use it for anything at all, your life, your business, how to fix your car, whatever it is. But it's a way of taking something and breaking it out into all of the parts that are involved. The goal of creating a mind map is to be able to use it to understand how these things might work together or overlap or be integrated in different ways. And so it's a tool for really understanding what's going on. So Barb, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So I use the mind map 4 or 5 times a week. And Virginia and I do the entire workshop every time before we share it with others. So this is my recent mind map. You can see my life in the center, as it will be in your mind map, which you're going to start in a few minutes, and parts of my life, family, survival. You don't have to worry about mixing categories. You can have feelings in there, just whatever comes up. The main point is to have something versus nothing, and to get the inside of your head out on paper where more choices then become possible. Next, once you have your 5 to 7 boxes, then you elaborate them and see what else is going on. So for example, under family, I've got the sister-in-law in the hospital, the mother-in-law that 3 days ago got diagnosed with metastatic cancer. I've got my son who is locked up in a jail with COVID. And so a lot going on in the family space. So just elaborate, again, to get the inside out and just see everything that's really going on. Virginia?
Okay, so it's your first exercise. We want you to, if you've never done this before, be gentle on yourself, go easy. Just get something, as Barb said, out and on paper. So you need a blank piece of paper, pens, and start by just drawing a box in the middle of your life and add on some extra boxes and keep going. We're going to give you, I want to check first that if there are any questions about how to proceed. It looks like no. So we're going to give you 7 minutes to create your mind map, and I'll give you a verbal warning 1 minute before we stop. So please go ahead and get started. Okay, so I'm going to ask you all to stop, and we're going to move on So hopefully you now have a mind map, sort of a snapshot of where you are today, and elaborate out as many of the pieces as you can in your life. So one way to view each part of this mind map is as a piece of a quilt. The quilt you might make if you were putting one together today that captured sort of this time in your life. And we use this metaphor as a quilt as a new way of thinking about our lives. And Barb, I'm going to turn this over to you. Actually, no, I'm going to talk about this. So this is Barb's pre-pandemic, sort of a digital quilt that she made from the mind map she did some time ago. We often use this as a way to introduce ourselves and as a kind of a business card. But the main thing I want to point out here without getting into the details is that the metaphor of the quilt is really this idea of life in all of its complexity stitched together. And so we'd like to now just turn to and consider this idea of a quilt as a metaphor. And I'm going to turn this over to Barb.
So Mary Catherine Bateson is one of my heroines. She really changed my life. I had 2 children in diapers and had just done a resume to make it look like my whole life had been designed to go after the job I was trying for. And of course, I had to leave out 95% of my life. And I was reading Bateson's Composing a Life, and she got into this looking around at her circle of friends and noticing a kind of malaise that characterized all their lives, including the college president, who was on the cover of magazines, herself a tenured professor at a very competitive university, a jewelry designer friend who was being shown in museums, all very successful women who didn't feel like they were successful. Now, one explanation for this is imposter syndrome, and that's a powerful one. Another is, as a cultural anthropologist, she gets underneath the culture and looks at the underlying architecture of thought in Western civilization and uncovers the quest. So the quest is a kind of skeletal infrastructure on which we array the data of our lives to create meaning. And the essence of the quest is to get from point A to B or A to Z, and not get knocked out of the saddle by any obstacles we overcome or any seductions that would take us off our path. She then looked again at her friends and thought, oh, the problem is none of us is living a quest fulfilled. So we don't have the satisfaction of having arrived at Z, which we imagined when we were 11 years old and fought to get to. So our lives don't follow the myth of the golden, searching for the golden grail or the Star Wars. I mean, just look at the narrative structures of our iconic stories. And she thought, well, what if there were metaphors more powerful for understanding our lives? And she came up with, for example, the quilt. What if the purpose of life isn't to get from A to B? What if the purpose is to have as many experiences as deeply as possible in as rich a way as we can imagine, to create a quilt of many colors and textures with which to wrap ourselves when the times are lonely and cold. Next. So this compares some of the characteristics of quest versus quilt. Thinking of Catherine's talk this morning, you know, the quest is more about the destination and the quilt is more about the journey. And of course, each of them has elements of the other. You don't make a quilt without going from A to Z on your quilt directions, and you don't have a quest without having to improvise quite a bit. But it's about the emphasis and what the metaphor allows you to imagine. So we're going to continue with this metaphor of the quilt today. Just look, I'm not going to read all this, but one of the biggest differences is the way we think of obstacles. So in the quest, you destroy the obstacles or you avoid them. In the quilt, you approach them with curiosity because they might be the next goal or they could be the next destination. So the jewelry designer got into it because her daughter's Girl Scout troop had a jewelry project, and she just went on from there. Mary Catherine Bateson was a tenured professor because she followed her husband around and got a job. So again, obstacles is the next goal. So quilts have been a way of telling stories and recording memories since time immemorial. Here are two, one from African American heritage, one from Bangladeshi with mantras and symbols critical to the culture. They're rich. They tell us more than a narrative. So let's look at the anatomy of a quilt as we play this out in our own lives. As we suggested before, the mind map can be converted into and understood as the quilt blocks, the top of the quilt, which is what we usually think of as a quilt. But any good quilt has got two more sections. There's the loft, which is the fluffy middle part, keeps us warm. And this is represented in our workshop by the dialogues we're having with ourselves and those we will have with others after the fact. The bottom is represented by the backing. The backing is going to be the part of our quilt workshop that is the principles and values by which we live. So next. The thing about the backing is it's usually invisible. You don't see it. You see the quilt squares. But if it's not strong, the whole quilt falls apart. If you've ever made a quilt, you know this. So it's actually the grounding of the quilt, just as our principles and values are the grounding of our lives. Virginia?
So what we're gonna have you do next is actually create your own quilt backing. And I'm gonna go over the instructions, and then before we start, we'll show you an example of what one looks like. The goal here is really just to kind of empty out your head, take and think about what principles, values, sayings, things that inform or guide your life, what runs in the background that you may not be fully conscious of. We want you to work fast, don't self-edit. This is really meant to come from more of your left brain than your right brain. I'm just going to show you a quick example. This is one from Barb, and you can see the kinds of things she jotted down. Swing at what comes across the plate. First things first. These are sort of the messages that you hear constantly as you go through your daily life. So I'm gonna leave these up while you work. We're gonna give you, if there are any questions about how to proceed, now's the time to ask. Looks like we don't have any. We're gonna give you 5 minutes for this activity, so take a fresh sheet of paper and get started. And we will start now, just at 11 o'clock. And I'll give you a 1 minute warning as before. And let's stop. Okay. So now that you've completed your backing, we're going to move into the second quadrant in terms of our design process. And we stay on the analytical side, the analytical part of the process, but move into the abstract realm. And we think of this quadrant as a reframe, because every mind map actually comes with a frame, a story. It's sort of a story that you tell yourself about your life. Our mind map is really our current story, or you can think of it as a point of view. In the next step, what we really want to do is take all that information, all those pieces in the mind map and the quilt backing, and create a new frame, a new story, one that opens up opportunities that you may not have considered or thought of before. So how do we do this? So don't start yet. We're going to go through the instructions and show you a quick example, and then get started. So one really good way to do this is to compare your mind map and your quilt backing, and look for incongruencies, gaps, inconsistencies, contradictions. These interstices is where the real gold is. This is where you can really get a lot of information. So we'd like you to go through your quilt and your backing and think about what you might want to leave out or reduce in importance as you go forward. And with what's left, how do they fit? Are they a coherent whole? What's missing? What's contradictory in each? And then try and improve the fit between the two by adding or subtracting from your backing and then your mind map. So here's an example from Barb, and I'll let Barb tell you about this.
So the first thing I did was, in my backing, I left out a lot of the negative mantras that run in my mind that I grew up with. Life is a veil of tears. Whoever said it was going to be a bed of roses. All of these things that kind of I wake up with and I'm depressed. And then I have a whole lot of work to do to be up before I get out of bed. So the backing gets a lot smaller with just those things I want to carry forward. And then comparing it to my mind map, I notice, wow, I used to have create on my mind map, but there was hardly anything related to it. And in this pandemic time, it's because my creativity has gone into all the other boxes where I've had to be very creative. And then I also noticed there is a big missing in my mind map. I have nothing that shows up as stop and smell the roses. It's all work. It's all work and worry over there. So I've added another box called joy. And by the way, for my own work, I just mind mapped joy, put it in the middle and looked at everything about it. So that's something you can do after today. But take a look at your mind map and your backing, leave off what you don't want to carry forward and add what you do. Okay.
Okay, so we're gonna start with your mind map and your quilt backing, and we recommend you have some pens with different colors. I'm gonna leave these instructions up as you can refer to them as you do this step. Are there any questions about how to actually do this part? It looks like nothing's coming up. So we're gonna give you 7 minutes for this activity. And we will start right now. And again, I'll give you a 1 minute warning. So please go ahead. We have a question from someone about, should we remove things from the mind map that we would like to see go away, even if they're likely not to disappear from our lives? For example, health problems. I think that's, this is entirely up to you, but if the idea is to, maybe that's a part of what you want to add on to your mind map, as this is something you want to work on or make go away or resolve in some way or learn to live with. Or you might want to imagine a future where it didn't exist at all. So there's no easy answer to that question, is the short answer.
You can also, if you copy it over, find yourself having time to do that now or later, simply make that box smaller so it doesn't take up as much space in your life, even though you still have to do the same things.
Okay, and we need to stop. Yep, and we need to stop. Okay. So reconciling the contradictions, gaps, the incongruencies between your quilt top, as described by your mind map, and the quilt backing is a way of revealing new possibilities about your life. And the question brought up a very specific one. So we're now going to move from the analysis side to the synthetic side, where of the design cycle, and use what we've uncovered in looking at these two together to imagine possible future lives. And following the metaphor that we've been using, these are new quilts that you might create. So we're going to actually have you come up with some ideas for your new quilts. And I'm going to, again, go through the instructions, and we'll show you an example before we get started. So what we want you to do is draw a quick template like this one, just a box, a title. Colored pens are great. The key thing here is not to write something, but to actually draw a picture. And the reason we want you to draw a picture is that it tends to be just much more generative for people. And much more left brain, so to speak. And once you have an image in your mind, you can also kind of see around the periphery of what's also going to be in that picture, and things that may be in that picture that you don't want to be in the picture. So it just gives you, it starts the sort of creative juices going. So we want to show you an example, and I'm going to turn it over to Barb. These are some of her future quilts.
So the first thing you notice about this is that I am no artist. And this should give you heart if you aren't either, because the most important thing is to just get something versus nothing in those quadrants, and something that represents for you what might be a different future than the one that is your default, more of what you're doing. So I came up with three. One was Two Good Women, which was going to be a consulting business with two women instead of one, with a client listening to whatever they come in the door with. And this, within 2 months, turned into our new business, Back Porch. The tiny house in the Santa Cruz Mountains was my second one. And my third one was returning to Africa to teach in either West or East Africa, where I've been invited to go. So these were my three. And as unremarkable as the art is, I can tell you that they're amazingly evocative for me and help me remember alternative lives ahead. Okay.
Okay, so we'll leave this up while you're working. I want to, if there's any questions, pop them up in the Q&A box. And we're going to give you 10 minutes for this activity. So let's get started. It's 11:20, and I'll give you, again, a 1-minute warning. Okay, it's time to stop. Somebody just commented that they just realized they can't really draw. I'm with you. I can't either. But
Me too.
Okay, so now let's think about these quilts in more detail. So how do you actually really think these through, and how do you evaluate them? So first of all, how does each one measure up? You know, what kind of evaluation are we going to use? And what we've chosen is to use these Pyrex measuring cups, which are the kind of things that I used when I was a kid and was cooking with my mother. And you may have noticed, but we sort of use domestic metaphors whenever possible because we feel they're more powerful and generative. I'm sure many of you in your work are really used to the sort of industrial mechanical measures that like dials, speed dials and traffic lights and all that kind of stuff that you find in dashboards. And we've deliberately chosen these because we think they're just more powerful and give people kind of a fresh way to look at things. So 3 measuring cups, 3 sort of bins that we want you to think about. One is support. One is what kind of support do I have? And that could be contacts, money, time. whatever it is you need. The second one is, do you love it? You know, does it really ring your chimes? Does it excite you? Does it bring you joy? And the third one is contribution. Is it a in this, you can think of this in any way that makes the most sense to you. Is it about your contribution to the world, to your own growth, to living a more authentic life, however you want to interpret that. And what we want you to do is don't try and make these work together. Just bin them separately and think of them separately. And so how does each measure up? Well, what we want you to do is just sort of scribble in whether you think it's full, half full, third full, a drop in the bottom, whatever it is, some kind of rough estimate for how you feel about your each measure. And we're just going to show you a quick example of what this looks like. And this is one of Barb's quilts. So I'm going to turn it over to Barb.
So, by the way, the reason contribution is important is there's a whole body of literature on how life satisfaction and even the health of our immune systems is related to the extent to which we feel we are contributing to a larger group than our own small self. So that's why that one's in there. As I went through and evaluated these, and you do it quickly, don't, assign points and wrap yourself around a poll on this one. It's just quick impressions. I realized I would have the least support for leaving the continent I live on and moving to Africa, and would have some support for moving to the mountains, provided I took my grandsons with me. Which would be fine. But the real one that I loved and where I had the support and contribution lined up, the more I thought about it, was this first one. And it was the low-hanging fruit, and I could go with it. So that's what evaluation did for me.
And we want to actually add 2 additional things to this part of it, the evaluation part of it, which is first a time frame. So just, top of your head, rough estimate, how long would it take to do this, or how long do you want to spend doing this? And then what questions immediately come up as you get to this phase? And we would like you to, jot those down at the bottom. And if you haven't done so already, you should be giving your future quilt a title. So we're going to leave this up just so you can remember each piece of the measuring cups. And we're going to this is really quick. We're going to give you 5 minutes for this activity, and we are going to so please get started, and we'll give you a 1-minute warning. So we have a question about, does support mean if it's high, or we need a lot of resources to do so? So I think support means what you have already. What kind of support do you have at this point to pursue, not what you need. I hope that answers your question. Okay. So you guys have done the hardest part. Really, this is, I think, where the real challenge comes in for most of us to get to this point. Moving to the next part of the design cycle in the 4th quadrant is where you would really plan. It's about rapid prototyping and testing, and sort of cycling through low cost, low risk, fast tests of what you might do. And we're going to leave that to you, because many of you already have these kinds of skills and do these in the work that you do now professionally. That said, we'd really like to give you some ideas about how you might go forward from here. I'm going to turn this over to Barb.
So just looking at these 3 bullets, you could continue into the 4th quadrant and do some plan and test. And in the rapid prototyping, you might say about each of your quilts or some aspect of your quilt, how might I try this out low risk, low cost, and quickly so that I get feedback and can do another how might I. So that would be activities to do in that fourth quadrant. Again, you could look at all 3 quilts. This would be the second bullet on here. All 3 quilts and see if there's something they have in common that you might test out. So all 3 of mine have in common a period of time where I would have no income. And so I might say, how might I test how that would really work? So while I still have an income, I could try living on no additional income and see how that would work. The other thing you can do is mind map anything that came up for you today. Just put it in the middle. I do it frequently with frustration. Put frustration in the middle and let everything angle off and see what's really going on in my head and where I can go from there. So those are some ideas of what you can do next, Virginia. And our favorite one is this one, is you create your own quilting circle. And I don't know about you, but my grandmother was in a quilting circle in her little church in Appalachia, and every Wednesday night for decades, they got together and worked on their quilts and their lives together. You could use the video, do it with friends at work, do the exercises together, and share the exercises. That's not possible in a Zoom webinar format, but it's incredibly powerful. It increases the loft of your quilt, as we talked about the loft. Share insights and gather monthly for accountability and to share experiences. As well, we want to point out that although we're mostly women here today, men benefit incredibly from this quilt metaphor, possibly because they've been so rigorously schooled in quests and heroic journeys and lone protagonists battling the beasts. But when we've used this at UC Berkeley in the MBA program, the men the men doing quilts and using Pyrex pictures to measure what's going on in their lives is also really incredible. And you could gather some of your male allies and friends to do a quilting circle. So those are some ideas.
And so we want to offer you 2 things, and then we'll take, I think, some questions. First of all, this is totally up to you. If you have a shareable next step that you want to share with us, please send it to us by email. Our emails are up here, and maybe Angela could post that in the chat box as well. And if you send us one shareable next step by May 7th, we'll consolidate them and send them back to anybody who responds. And this, one of the things we're thinking of is that one of you may have the resource or the information or the person that someone else needs to talk to. And so this could be the start of a great collaboration or sponsorship, as we heard Catherine talk about in the keynote speech. So we want to offer that to you. And secondly, we want to offer to you, we're going to do free back porch Zoom sessions to some of you sign up below. And there is a link at the bottom where you can fill out a little, a quick Google form. And again, Angela, would you post that link in the Q&A or in the chat box? If you guys don't get it, please email us and we'll send it to you. So we're going to hold 30-minute sessions with the 2 of us and one of you. And we're going to do this May 12th, 13th, and 14th. And we're happy to talk about any topic of your choice. And then I'm going to turn it over to Barb.
So we want to say kudos for you for hanging in this far. We'd like to open it up for a few minutes of questions. If you have any about the overall process, any one-liners or one words about your takeaways, key takeaways today, just let us know. And Angela, if you could raise any questions or mention anything that's coming through before we completely say goodbye.
Yeah, I think there's one question that's particularly timely from Ellen. She asked, this is a fabulous exercise and clarifies a great deal, but she finds herself asking throughout, how would COVID impact everything? So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I'll jump in right away on that. As I mentioned, Virginia and I go through this whole workshop with each other before we do it each time. And when we did it this time, I realized that I had been living in a coma since we started self-isolating. We have some medical conditions in our family and have been self-isolating, which is even more than sheltering in place. And I had just gone into a coma, meaning I dissociate and I just kind of wait for it to be over, the white knuckling in a way that Virginia talked about. So just going through the workshop itself is an incredible tool in the time of pandemic. I also realized that although journaling is a daily practice for me for finding out what I think and what's going on with me, I hadn't done it since we started self-isolating, and I didn't even realize it, that I hadn't done the journal for 6 weeks. So the workshop, knowing that we were going to be with you all to do it, I want to thank you because I did the workshop and came out of my coma and have a lot more going on now. So I hope that speaks to your question. Angela, other questions?
There's a question around would slides be shared for reference? I know we will have a recording.
So Barb, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think everything in the recording will be here. And then what we'd really like to do, if you would like any of the slides, is for you to talk to us about what you want them for, so that we can have a conversation and ensure that you have the best slide for what you want, including some that we have omitted. This is actually a 95 slide doodah in one version. So let us know what you need and what you're thinking of doing.
Yeah, so regarding the link, I just typed it into the Q&A, but the best thing, if you can't, if you don't get the link from that, please just pop us an email, one of us, and I'll send it to you by email. The thing about the slides is that I think what people will find is that most of the image and the images don't convey the full import of what we're trying to talk about. And so what we really like to do is to talk to people one-on-one and find out how we can really help them. And it may be through other kinds, we have other sorts of support material and exercises that may be also useful to you. And so if one of those is a better fit for what you're struggling with or what you're interested in doing, we'd like to be able to have a conversation with you and suggest something that's much more relevant and tailored to your particular need or your group or your company or whatever it is. So just get in touch and we'll have a chat. People are still asking for the link, and I'm not sure it's transferred. Yeah, you may have to email it to us. I did type it in and send it, but I'm not sure it went live. Okay, are there any other questions,
Yeah.
Angela?
There's a good one from Melanie. She said, I found that in values, I was actually writing down all the old messaging from my childhood. How do I separate out what are old tapes and what are the values I'm trying to incorporate and live my life by? And then how do I supplant the former with the latter?
That's a great question. Barb, do you want to take that one?
Sure. The thing to remember about the old values, including the inner critics, is that they arose at a time in our lives, often long ago, where they were the best thing we could come up with for our own survival or thriving. So it's not about stomping them out. It's about getting them out of our heads onto paper where we can see them, thanking them for their contribution, honoring them by remembering or imagining where we might have picked them up, and keeping them around as artifacts, almost like a scrapbook as we move on. The thing is, if you fight them, they will grow. So you must pause and honor them, and then you can move on beyond them. So how it worked in the workshop and how it actually works for me in my journal is simply to copy over what I want and then leave off what I'm going to leave behind. But like I say, honoring it as I let it go. Let me also say, one of the things that's haunting us and throughout all of our workshops is this imposter syndrome. And one way to honor the imposter syndrome is to understand that the stronger our imposter syndrome, the more indicative it is of our empathic ability to understand what the norms and values are of the systems we're inside of that are not supporting us. So when I feel like I'm irrelevant because I'm the only woman in the room, I am getting that. I am picking that up. It's not in my head. I'm picking that up and honoring that I have the ability to understand what the rules are here, that you have to be a white male to be sitting in this room. And that overcoming my imposter syndrome is a radical revolutionary act, that the mere act of showing up where it is that I'm feeling imposter syndrome is a revolutionary act. And with each time I do it, I am furthering the revolution, the rising up of all of us into those places that have told us in 1,000 ways that we pick up in the form of imposter syndrome, told us in 1,000 ways we don't belong. And suddenly there we are. And maybe we're even leading the conversation.
And I love Barb's point, and this comes up all the time. We actually have a great article written by somebody for The Guardian that if you pop us an email, we'd be happy to send it to you. Angela, I think there's a couple other questions. One person asks about the connecting the back quilt to the top mind map, how that works.
Yeah, they asked to show the slide again on observe the quilt backing, so they have another chance to look at the interpretation.
I'm not sure exactly which slide you want.
Probably the side by side.
The side by side. Oh, yes. Okay. So this is maybe this was our example that we gave from your quilt. Okay, this is so on the left-hand side here, it may not have been entirely clear. On the left-hand side was the mind map that Barb drew, and on the right-hand side is the backing that she drew.
And the right-hand side is the revised backing. So it left off things like life is a veil of tears and, you know, life is a game and then you die. Things that don't exactly make you want to get up in the morning and get going on something generative and creative, full of contribution for the world. Stop and smell the roses with all of these things that are on this backing were on the original backing, but are the ones I carried forward. And the one in red, Stop and Smell the Roses, I realized I had nothing on my mind map that mapped to that value. And yet it's a very powerful value and one I want to amplify to grow going forward. So I added a box to my mind map of joy. And then that's a little bit of homework for me after the workshop to do a mind map on joy, what gives me joy, what reduces my joy, how might I increase it, and then that mind map changes. And then I realized the box that was create had almost nothing on it, which made me feel really bad, you know, because I'm very creative and I love to create. So why isn't there anything on create? Well, it turns out in the pandemic, all my creative juices have gone into all these other aspects, not to mention the fact I was losing a lot of energy on being in a coma. So that's how they fit together, is you try to have things in your mind map that express your values, and you try to have in your values things that are playing out in the mind map.
There's another question I see that I wanted to address from Lydia saying, I'm about 40 and I'm being totally honest, saying that I fear it may be a bit late for me for a big change. Is it really never too late? So just to give you a personal example, I started graduate school when I was 30. I started my first business when I was in my 40s. That's when I really started becoming an entrepreneur. I got married when I was 52, and I'm right now reinventing myself along using Back Porch and with Barbara, and I just turned 64. So
and I just turned 74.
So there's hope for all of us.
We're the proof.
So I think, and this is not to minimize the difficulty, because this most recent reinvention of mine. So I live in a two-body problem. My husband is a scientist as well, and so he's a very complicated gig that's kind of well set up. And difficult to move. He's a guy who's difficult to move. So it is incredibly difficult. It is incredibly hard. Each time I have reinvented myself, and I would say I'm on my third or fourth career, it's been a struggle, and it takes quite a bit of time to bring things to fruition. If it was easy, anybody would do it. And I want to acknowledge your bravery and your willingness to take risks and to dive in to the unknown. And I think the only way you do succeed in these things is by doing the hard work, taking the risks, and hopefully having a supportive environment where people are willing to stand by you as you do it, because it's not always really pretty. So I hope that's helpful.
And I think just added to what Virginia said, honor the doubt that you have that 40 may be too late, and realize where it's coming from. You are surrounded by doubt telling you that 40 is too late. And so you will be operating in that context. So it's very important to create alternative structures for yourself. A quilting circle of 40 and older, for example. You're not making it up. Ageism is real, and it's out there, and it's really prevalent in the US. One of the reasons I would like to go back to Africa is my colleagues there who are teaching in the university as I would be, and who've invited me to join them. They do not stop until they drop dead, because they are honored as elders, they are respected, and they are needed. Whereas, for example, in the US, we get the message that, well, if you're 60 or over, you should go ahead and die so the economy can flourish. That's a pretty powerful suggestion about 40 being too late. I would like to just add, though, that we adopted our first child when I was 40 and our second when I was 42. So it's not even too late to have kids at 40 if you haven't done that yet and would like to. So we want to conclude by just thanking you all profusely for being with us, and to give yourself kudos for diving into this most rewarding and challenging design project of our lives, designing our lives together. Thank you so much. Bye now.
Bye, everyone.